So good afternoon, and thanks to my fellow panelists for the rich presentations today. You've inspired us, challenged us, and provoked us to take up these topics during our discussions. My name is Emily Gallagher, and I represent a very large team, which I will discuss over the course of this presentation. But let me recognize in the room George Schoneveld and Maoli Sever, who is in the back, and did not get to introduce himself today, for their contributions to this presentation. Next slide, please. The Governing Multifunctional Landscapes Project is a multi-country consortium of projects which all aim to address knowledge, technical, and policy gaps related to forest and land governance. Drivers of deforestation related to forestry and ag sectors, wood fuel, and ultimately sustainable forest and land use management, and the improvement of livelihoods. It's about managing the trade-offs between social and ecological impacts. Our work in Ghana is conceived as a project to reduce commodity-driven deforestation and promote climate-smart and forest-friendly commodities through a landscape or jurisdictional approach. So I think we're in the right room today with the right people to discuss these topics. This project is funded by the EC, Directorate General for International Partnerships, and is coming to a close this month in terms of our activities, and then close the year with our outputs. So this is a map of the GML project countries. Next slide. Now, the GML objectives in Ghana are to pilot a jurisdictional approach to sustainable land use planning for forest risk commodities and low emissions development, develop protocols for monitoring and modeling land use transitions, not just from crops to forest, forest to crops, but between different crops. Propose inclusive business models, and I heard Abena mention that today, and improve service supply delivery for climate-smart and forest-friendly tree cropping systems, and then also develop a blueprint and a guide for implementation and scaling. Next slide. The project actually launched in 2018, and George mentioned this already. We had the benefit of scoping across multiple countries and landscapes to develop assessment criteria for how you site a territorial or just jurisdictional project. Once we grounded ourselves in Ghana, the next step was to establish partnerships and begin generating baseline evidence before embarking on planning for change. And we all know what happened in 2020, Abena just reminded us, but we did continue with data collection through our great partners, which I will mention in a moment. And by 2021, we were able to launch multi-stakeholder platforms, which is where we situate the collaborative decision making. In the final year in which we are now, we are socializing these strategies to solicit prospective partners, and we hope to talk to you all today, funders who are outside this room, and working closely with stakeholders for institutional uptake at different levels. So, next slide. There were two criteria for citing our project landscape. The first was deforestation. So this is a deforestation hotspot analysis, which we conducted to locate potential areas where deforestation is there, it is there every year, and it is either persistently there or it's increasing. The map on the right shows the location of Gallagher municipality and Atiwa West District in the eastern region. Next slide. We were also looking for a multifunctional landscape with tree crops preferably, because this is the systems we know best. And what we found in Gallagher and Atiwa West is this dynamic landscape with cocoa, of course, but also the largest production area for oil palm, a growing rubber footprint, declining citrus, and other crops supporting these tree crop landscapes. The landscape includes research institutions and experts in each of these crops, and informal buyers and processors in some areas, and a variety of service models which have been trialed over time. But importantly, in this landscape, farmers in this landscape have choices about what they produce. And in some crops, they have choices about which farming systems, which business models they will adopt. So this landscape is not yet under, also this landscape is not yet under another landscape approach. It was not under a governance regime. There were no other NGOs working on landscape or jurisdictional approaches in this area. There are no agreements in this landscape. However, the landscape has already been identified as a future HIA. It is known as the Atiwa East Akin HIA, which is now multiple districts. So we think that we've come into a landscape where the partners are leaving well positioned in anticipation of the HIA approach when this rolls out. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 E's of sustainability that we asked each of the partners to think about today, and everybody addresses this in their own way. But so sustainability is like this 3-legged stool. If any of the legs are weak, removed, or ignored, the stool cannot stand up for very long. So for us, economy is about increasing production on farms or sustainable intensification. Agroecology or ecology is about promoting climate-smart agriculture and forest-friendly practices. And equity is about improving benefits to local people. Next slide. So the landscape issues that emerged during our scoping and stakeholder analysis showed that although this is a tree commodity landscape with so much expertise and private sector champions in each of these tree crops, the productivity is abysmally low. There are high costs of production, there's labor competition with other sectors, and there's a huge service delivery gap in many of these sectors. In terms of ecology, there are these dynamic land use transitions, which I mentioned, moving from one crop to a different crop, which over time leads to net deforestation and land degradation. There's land degradation from the mining sector, and galamsey is increasing in the landscape as we learn each time we visit. There's also climate variability. There's longer dry seasons, more frequent droughts, more intense rains. There's also environmental pollution, air, water, public health coming from the artisanal sector, both in mining and in oil. In terms of equity, there's intergenerational inequality. There's not access to land for everybody, so there's a challenge for the youth to enter the ag sector if they want to. There's a large youth exodus from the ag sector for mining. There is really interesting gendered value chain participation because of the oil palm and palm oil processing, but there's also this aspect where there's poor benefit sharing mechanisms among some of the value chain actors. So there are some durable inequalities which are structured into the ways in which some of these value chains function, which creates lose-lose scenarios. Poor farmers have low yields. Low yields mean they don't have enough capital to reinvest in their farms, and they have this cycle of poverty. And integrated landscape approaches aim for win-win-win on all 3 legs of these stools, positively reinforcing income generation invested on farms to raise yields, stimulate local economies, improve more incomes, and hopefully, hypothetically, to avoid mining and deforestation. Next slide. So let me talk about our roadmap and our project design. Next slide. The project is designed in 3 steps. The first is to generate baseline evidence, knowledge generation and practice. The second is towards collaborative planning, engagement activities with stakeholders for policy change and impact. And the third is to establish an investment case to develop and evaluate business models and financing options. Next slide. So in terms of generating knowledge, we asked ourselves, what is the extent of deforestation and carbon emissions embedded in these commodities? What are the characteristics of different producers? What are the challenges? Where are there opportunities to enhance their sustainability? Next slide. So our roadmap for baselining is creating land use maps like many of these projects have done, and analyzing the transitions from one land use category to another, and understanding what is driving these transitions and to what effect. We also want to understand practices on the ground, why farmers and processors do what they do, and what are the opportunities for improving their practices. And then analyzing these data and bringing it to the communities for interpretation and scenario analysis. Next slide. So we worked with KNUST, who are here in the room with us today, to develop protocols and land use maps for this multifunctional landscape. And we should say that KNUST was joined by the Forestry Commission Mapping Unit, who is also in the room with us today, and went through a very rigorous process, which some of you know, to have the approach and the maps validated by a technical working group, the Forestry Commission Climate Change Directorate. Next slide. So here's what they found. We are seeing net forest loss in terms of closed forests, but we are seeing even bigger losses from cocoa and oil palm, and at about the same proportion. We see gains in mining, rubber, and in croplands. Next slide. So this is another way of visualizing this information. But importantly, and remember the deforestation map which I showed you earlier, we know that there is net forest loss and that this is persistent from year to year. And in all of these land use transitions, the net effect is that forest trees are coming down. So we see closed forest decreasing in red, monoculture cocoa decreasing in red, oil palm decreasing, and the other land areas are increasing in the green circles. Next slide. We also conducted almost 800 farmer and plot level surveys. We want to recognize University of Ghana, who is also in the room, and the Forest and Horticultural Crops Research Center, or FOCREC, which also supported 6 students to work through their master's degrees. Oh, sorry, this is one. Next slide. You see their topics there. Next slide. From the farmer and plot level surveys, we're still working through the data set, which we will for many moons to come. But there are some important findings for developing interventions in the immediate term. Importantly, yield gaps are extreme, 73% in oil palm, 61% in cocoa. And this means that there is more than a 70% difference between potential yields and what farmers are actually harvesting. We have been playing with the service packages and adoption rates, and we can see that a package which includes labor, fertilizer, pesticide applied using gap management recommendations, and cocoa has a yield increase of 60%, getting closer to closing the yield gap. But profits are not in proportion to yields because of the high cost of labor. So there are trade-offs, and we are modeling different scenarios to advise service provision. Skilled labor is really important, and we're learning that skilled labor is exiting the sectors. It leads to a yield increase, only a mild profit increase because of the cost of labor, but there's a positive effect on food security. So if we can get the win-win-win scenarios right and reduce the risk of abandoning cash crops for subsistence production, for food security, or mining for fast cash, then we can better design and advise interventions. So next slide. We're looking at inputs. You can see that service and input packages across the landscape are not equal. We're also looking at services. Next slide. Also not distributed equally across the landscape. And what we see is that on the eastern side of the landscape where there's dominant cocoa, that's where you see the high service use. On the western side of the landscape that's dominated by oil palm, we are in a service desert. Next slide. We also did enterprise assessments. Next slide. Gender value chain assessments. Next slide. Learned about the barriers to women in participating in these value chains. Next slide. Next slide. And then next slide. And this brings us to our second step, which is collaborative planning, engagement of activities with stakeholders for policy change and impact. So what we try to understand is how can jurisdictional governance arrangements to zero deforestation be designed to enhance the effectiveness, viability, and scalability of strategic development plans in support of sustainability objectives. Next slide. And so our roadmap for sustainable planning, for collaborative planning, looks very much like your approaches. The differences might be that we conceive of these man-driven approaches as collaborative learning platforms. It starts with stakeholder analysis, then we launch, and then we do the needs assessment coming out of these early workshops. We do adaptive workshop models based on the capacities and the capabilities of the members, and this leads to a blueprint or a roadmap of the approach, and closes where we are today at this national level workshop. Next slide. Integrated approaches, including our approach, must be multi-stakeholder, multi-scalar, and multifunctional to work across such a dynamic landscape and all the landscapes which you described. Next slide. But let's talk about some of the design elements, and this is our platform design. So here I'm going to talk about some particular design decisions that we made coming out of the scoping, stakeholder analysis, and the data collection which I shared with you that make this approach differ a little bit from the other approaches on the ground. The fundamental building blocks for the GML landscape approach are these commodity working groups, which you see on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we also have these community-level platforms. Each of these represent the major commodity crops and the diversity of value chain actors in the sectors. Sitting in the working groups, we have representatives from local government, government agencies who serve these sectors, including staff and elected officials, traditional authorities, farm organizations, private sector businesses, artisanal millers, and oil palm and artisanal miners. They join the community platform, then together to form the landscape platform. Next slide. The landscape platform is hosted by the assemblies, so we alternate between Kwabi and Atiwa West. CIFOR, Accra, and other research partners and CSOs, when they join us, we all join at that platform level. So what makes this approach a bit different is that we did not set ourselves up as a landscape manager, as many of the approaches in this room have done. This phase of the project was funded only to design strategies, to build governance structures, to start working on capacity building, and get us through the gate just before implementation. So we did not create a landscape management board, as the process was designed that this landscape management structure should emerge from the groups themselves. The landscape platform is a networking space, a space to present plans and seek alignment and coherency with other platform members. And there are implications for these design decisions, which I hope we can discuss in the panel discussion. Next slide. So these are the representatives on the platform, and I just want to recognize that the Cocoa Working Group is led by the Cocoa Health and Extension Division, the Rubber Working Group by the Forest and Horticultural Crops Research Center, the Oil Palm Working Group by CSIR OPRI, and the Mine Reclamation Working Group by the Environmental Protection Agency. So what's really important about this approach is that rather than creating a third-party management structure and introducing new levels of governance, this approach is embedded in those agencies and those government bodies whose mandate it already is to manage these sectors. They are mandated to work within these sectors and help develop them. And they form the foundation of this landscape platform. Next slide. So the final step is developing and evaluating business models and financing options, and I realize I'm over time, so I'm going to skip right through this. Next one. And this is about setting up a multi-stakeholder approach, which we've done, evaluating scenarios and trying to connect our landscape level actors to finance and investment for the long-term sustainability of the project. Next slide. So in an implementation from research to action, next slide, each of the working groups went through an intensive process of doing their own problem analysis, situation analysis, going to solution analysis. They learned how to do theories of change, action plans, and then ultimately they have each drafted a development strategy. And in the back of the room we have copies of a summary of each of the development strategies developed by each of these groups. They also went through training on how to develop a funding plan and take that funding plan and start to pull out concept notes. So now they have something in hand, a full strategy, and concept notes that they can carry with them to solicit partnerships and investment to move towards the implementation of these strategies. Next slide. That's the theory of change. Next. The community platforms also similarly went through some problem analysis and solution analysis, but their goals are different. So they are using this to feed into the working group strategies, to provide recommendations to the working groups, and then the working groups, as they were developing the strategies, we were iterating with the community platforms to share the information with them and use them as a consultative body. They also participated in participatory land use mapping, so that we could take those high-level remote sensing developed maps and bring it down to the community level so that they could do something that would be tactile and they could get their hands on. Next slide. And so we just had an event Tuesday where we're learning how some of these processes are being taken up by each of the working groups. So another piece of our landscape platform, of course, our jurisdictional level government. Our district assemblies are represented here today. And I want to recognize the MCE and the DCE of each of the districts. And we have learned how the different districts, through their planning offices, are starting to integrate some of those aspects of those development strategies into their midterm development plans. Next slide. We have a research network who's worked with us over the course of the project, and the information from them will be coming out over time. Next. And then there's the civil society network. So we approached many of you in this room at the start of the project to do a resource day with each of our partners to start preparing them and understanding what are some of these other approaches that are happening around the country, what are some of the activities and ways of developing their strategies that are already ongoing in other parts of government. We've also had some learning day and stakeholder meetings and exploring partnerships, as I mentioned, with the concept of development. Next slide. So now I'm going to save some of the lessons learned, but